Well, the news this morning's been out of Biarritz in France following the G7 summit, and joining me now to discuss some of those issues is Liberal MP Dave Sharma. Dave, good morning to you. Thanks very much for joining us. First of all, I want to ask you about some of the Macron decisions this morning in terms of inviting Iran to the G7 and not really telling anyone about it. What do you make of this kind of diplomacy?
Well, look, it's clearly a surprise. I don't think any of the other leaders were expecting the Iranian foreign minister to turn up in Biarritz. Macron and the French are very attached to the Iranian nuclear deal, the one that the US withdrew from over a year ago now. And obviously, I think Macron is trying to make sure that some sort of deal can be resurrected. And look, you know, in credit to him, diplomacy is always a good thing to try, and it's important for the sides to be talking to one another. So if he can help broker some sort of arrangement between Iran and the rest of the world, I think that would be a good thing.
Well, you know, it's a shrewd move, and if there's anything Donald Trump doesn't like, it's being blindsided, and there are strong suggestions here. I mean, I think he probably would have been blindsided because he wasn't told about it, and Scott Morrison said in his press conference a short time ago that he wasn't expecting it as well. So do you think, I mean, that it is shrewd, that it is possibly a good thing, or was there a touch of naivety there and it could backfire?
Look, we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, the normal practice, though, between close allies is obviously you want to avoid surprises and you want to let your allies know what you're thinking and planning of doing. So obviously that wasn't the case here. We'll see how it works out for the French.
The other big issue that's taking place at the moment, the US-China trade war. Dave, is there a danger that Australia is going to get caught in no man's land here?
Well, I don't think we'll get caught in no man's land, but there's a danger here for the world economy, and of course Australia is, you know, a trading nation, a globally integrated economy. We're part of the world economy, and we already are seeing the world economy, the global economy, suffer from the effects of this protracted now US-China trade war. Not only us, the European economy, the US economy, the Chinese economy too. I mean, the whole thing with trade is when nations trade, there's mutual benefit, and so when nations trade, there's mutual harm, and we're all suffering the consequences of this.
There's some talk over the weekend that Donald Trump is regarded as the biggest threat to global markets at the moment. Is that a sentiment that you'd share?
No, it's not a sentiment I share, but I would say that the US-China trade war is, you know, one of the biggest macro risks out there to the global economy right now, undoubtedly.
And so do you think that he was probably right that you know, to an extent, that China probably needed to be reined in?
Well, I think, as the Prime Minister said overnight, the US has legitimate trade interests here that it's raising and discussing with China to do with things like state-owned enterprises, protection of intellectual property, protection of foreign investors, those sorts of things. And it was, I think it's important that these issues are addressed, but it would be good if they're addressed in as contained a way as possible so that the trading relationship between the US and China is preserved and China's integration into the global economy is preserved as well. That's been, you know, really a feature of the world trading system over the last 25 to 30 years is China's integration into the global economy. And it's caused some disruption in parts of the world, including in America and Australia, but it's overwhelmingly been for the good of us and for the Chinese people as well.
Yeah. Dave, some of the cynics have suggested that one of the reasons, and there are several reasons why Australia militarily did get involved with the Strait of Hormuz at the moment, but that it might also be to curry favour with the United States if we ever need help in the South China Sea. Does that have, you know, some kind of reason or some kind of logic behind it?
Well, what I'd say is that, you know, we are committing to this operation in the Strait of Hormuz in support of values and principles that we hold very dear, the freedom of commercial shipping, freedom of navigation, allowing countries to trade freely with one another. And that right is as important to us in the Strait of Hormuz and in the Middle East as it is to us in the South China Sea. As a trading nation, as a commercial nation, we want the underpinnings of that system to remain in place, and the attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz have been worrying to us because we're stakeholders in that system.
Yeah, with so much fuel coming through there. Just on another issue, I mean, we always talk about Hong Kong escalating and escalating and escalating. Well, it did escalate overnight. Water cannons were used. There were even warning shots that were fired. There's a two-tiered question here, Dave. First of all, you know, how concerned are you about that escalation?
Look, I'm very concerned. I think particularly the growing use of violence by the protesters and then the law enforcement agencies in response to it. I mean, there were, you know, petrol bombs used last night. Some protesters were attempting to attack a policeman with bamboo sticks, which is when this live round was fired, reportedly. I think that's worrying because, you know, the right to peaceful protest is a legitimate right, and that should always be respected. But when the protests veer into violence, it can often, spiral out of control. And I think that the tactics that some of the protesters have adopted in Hong Kong over the last 24 hours have been concerning.
Yeah, and there are strong fears now, and these fears are getting stronger by the day, that China may well get involved. They may well cross the border and invade and get involved militarily in Hong Kong, and that might lead to, a lot of people in Hong Kong seeking refuge in Australia, almost, mirroring the events of 30 years. Does the government have a plan here to deal with that in the event of people fearing persecution in Hong Kong?
Look, I'm not going to get into the hypotheticals there, if you don't mind, Peter, but I would say we're following the situation in Hong Kong very closely, and ideally we'd like to see Hong Kong institutions and Hong Kong systems and the Hong Kong government resolve this issue by, paying attention to the concerns of the protesters, doing what they can to addressing them, but making sure that the integrity of one country, two systems, the settlement that Hong Kong is part of, is preserved. And I think this is why it's so important that these protests have an organic root. They've come out of Hong Kong and they need to be resolved in Hong Kong, and that's certainly what the message that we've been passing on.
All right, Dave Sharma, Liberal MP for Wentworth, really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Pete.